Tonight, I am going to tell you 5 true lighthouse horror stories. Not made up, not fiction, not creepypasta nonsense from the internet. These are real stories, real places, real people, real terror. These are the stories that lighthouse keepers whispered to each other in the dark. The stories they begged people to believe. The stories that drove some of them completely insane. Story 1: The Piano Ghost of Seguin Island. Off the coast of Maine, there is a small island called Seguin Island. It is only 64 acres of rock and grass and fog. Nothing special to look at. Nothing remarkable at all, except for one thing: the lighthouse. Seguin Island Lighthouse was built in 1795. That makes it one of the oldest lighthouses in America. For over 200 years, it has stood on that lonely rock, warning ships away from the dangerous waters below. But there is something else on that island, something that has been there almost as long as the lighthouse itself, something that you can hear on quiet nights, drifting across the fog. Piano music. A single song, playing over and over again, even though there is no piano on the island. Even though there hasn't been a piano there for over 150 years. Let me tell you how it started. Let me tell you about the lighthouse keeper and his wife. Let me tell you about the most tragic love story you will ever hear. In the middle of the 1800s, a young man was assigned to be the keeper of Seguin Island Lighthouse. History has forgotten his name, but it has not forgotten what he did. He came to the island with his new wife. A beautiful young woman who had never lived away from civilization before. Now, you have to understand what life was like for lighthouse keepers back then. This was not a job. This was exile, complete and total isolation from the rest of the world. There were no phones, no radios, no internet, no way to call for help, no way to talk to friends or family. Supply boats only came every few months, and during the harsh Maine winters, they couldn't come at all. The ice and storms made it impossible. So this young couple was trapped, alone together on a tiny island, miles from the nearest town, miles from the nearest person, just the two of them, the lighthouse, and the endless gray ocean stretching out in every direction. At first, it was romantic. They were newlyweds. They were in love. They told themselves it would be an adventure. But weeks turned into months. The fog rolled in and never seemed to leave. The sound of the waves became maddening, crashing against the rocks day and night, never stopping, never changing. The same view every single day, the same tiny rooms, the same cold, damp air. And slowly, something inside the young wife began to break. It started small. She would stare out the window for hours without speaking. Her husband would call her name and she wouldn't respond. She stopped eating full meals. She stopped sleeping through the night. She would wake up screaming about faces she saw in the fog. The keeper didn't know what to do. He loved his wife more than anything in the world. He had brought her to this lonely place, and now he was watching her fall apart. He felt helpless. He felt guilty. He would have done anything to make her happy again. So he saved every penny he earned. For months, he put aside money from his small salary, and when the supply boat came, he placed a special order. A piano. He remembered that his wife used to play piano back on the mainland. She wasn't very good at it, but she loved music. She loved the way it filled her room. He thought maybe, just maybe, if she had something to do, something to love, something to fill the silence, she might get better. When the piano finally arrived on the supply boat, his wife cried tears of joy. She hugged him so tight he could barely breathe. She kissed his face over and over again. For the first time in months, she smiled. That night, She sat down at the piano and began to play. Now here is the thing you need to know. She only knew one song, just one. A simple melody that she had learned as a child. Nothing fancy, nothing complicated, just a few minutes of notes that repeated over and over. She played that song perfectly, and then she played it again, and again, and again. At first, the keeper didn't mind. He was so happy to see his wife smiling again. He was so relieved that she was eating, sleeping, acting like herself. He told himself the music was beautiful. He told himself he loved hearing it. 1 week passed, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. She never stopped playing. Every morning, she would wake up before dawn and go straight to the piano. She would play that same song until her husband made her stop for breakfast. Then she would go back to playing. She would play through lunch, through dinner, through the night. He would wake up at 2 in the morning and hear those same notes drifting up through the floor. That same melody, those same keys, over and over and over again. The keeper started to notice something was wrong. His wife wasn't just playing piano, she was obsessed with it. She would play until her fingers were raw and bleeding. She would play until she collapsed from exhaustion, and even in her sleep, her fingers would twitch, moving across invisible keys. He tried to talk to her about it. He tried to get her to take breaks, to go for walks, to do anything else. But she would just look at him with those empty eyes and say she couldn't stop. The music wouldn't let her stop. She had to keep playing. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. That same song, those same notes, echoing through the lighthouse, seeping into the walls, into the furniture, into the keeper's brain. He started hearing it even when she wasn't playing. He would be checking the lighthouse lamp at the top of the tower, and he would hear that melody in his head. He would be trying to sleep, and those notes would play on repeat behind his eyes. He couldn't escape it. He couldn't get away from it. The music was everywhere. It was everything. It was driving him insane. He begged his wife to stop. He got down on his knees and pleaded with her. He screamed at her until his throat was raw. He threatened to throw the piano into the ocean. But she just looked at him with those dead, empty eyes and kept playing, her fingers moving across the keys like they had a life of their own. That same song, over and over, forever. The keeper stopped sleeping. He stopped eating. He would pace around the lighthouse with his hands over his ears, but it didn't help. The music was inside him now. It was part of him. He couldn't get it out. He started talking to himself, arguing with himself, making plans that made no sense. His mind was crumbling, piece by piece, note by note. And then one night, something inside him finally snapped. He went down to the basement where they kept the tools. His hands were shaking. His eyes were wild. That music was pounding in his head like a hammer. He had to make it stop. He would do anything to make it stop. He grabbed an axe. He walked up the stairs, slowly, one step at a time. His wife was in the main room, sitting at that cursed piano, her back to him, playing that song, always that same song, her fingers dancing across the keys like nothing was wrong. She didn't turn around. She didn't hear him coming. Or maybe she did. Maybe she knew. Maybe she just didn't care anymore. The keeper raised the axe over his head. His whole body was trembling. Tears were streaming down his face. He loved this woman. He had loved her more than life itself. But that music, that horrible, endless, maddening music. He brought the axe down. Not on his wife. Not yet. On the piano. He smashed it with everything he had. Every key, every string, every piece of polished wood. He destroyed it completely. He reduced it to splinters and sawdust. He didn't stop until there was nothing left. And finally, the music stopped. The lighthouse was silent for the first time in months. The keeper stood there, breathing hard, the axe hanging from his exhausted hands. It was over. The nightmare was finally over. But then he looked at his wife. She was still sitting on the bench, still facing forward. Her hands were still raised, her fingers still moving, playing invisible keys, playing a piano that no longer existed. And she was smiling. Something in the keeper broke completely at that moment. Whatever sanity he had left shattered like glass. He looked at his wife, at that horrible smile, at those moving fingers, and he knew that the music would never really stop, not as long as she was alive. I won't describe what happened next. I can't. Some things are too horrible to put into words. But when the supply boat arrived several months later, the crew found a nightmare waiting for them on Seguin Island. The piano was destroyed, the wife was dead, and the keeper had taken his own life. Some say he threw himself from the top of the lighthouse. Others say he walked into the ocean and never came back. The details have been lost to time. But here is the part that will keep you awake tonight. The piano music didn't stop. Even after the bodies were removed, even after the lighthouse was cleaned and repaired, even after new keepers were assigned to the island, the music kept playing. That same song, those same notes, drifting through the fog, coming from somewhere inside the lighthouse. The first new keeper lasted only 3 weeks before he demanded to be transferred. He said he heard piano music every night. He said he saw a woman sitting at a piano bench in the main room, but when he got closer, she vanished. He said she turned to look at him once, and her face was wrong, too pale, too thin, with eyes that were completely black. The second new keeper lasted 2 months. He wrote letters to his family saying the lighthouse was haunted. He begged them to get him reassigned. His last letter said he had stopped sleeping because every time he closed his eyes, he saw the woman standing over his bed, playing invisible keys, smiling that horrible smile. He was found dead 3 days later. Heart attack, they said, but the expression frozen on his face suggested he had been scared to death. Over the years, keeper after keeper reported the same things: the piano music, the woman at the bench, the feeling of being watched. Some of them quit, some of them went insane, some of them died under mysterious circumstances. The Coast Guard eventually took over the lighthouse. Military personnel were stationed there, tough men who didn't believe in ghosts or hauntings or anything supernatural. They changed their minds quickly. In 1985, a Coast Guard officer named James Mitchell was stationed at Seguin Island for routine maintenance. He was there alone, just for one night, to check the equipment. He was a practical man, a skeptic. He had laughed at the stories about the piano ghost. He wasn't laughing by morning. In his official report, which I found in old Coast Guard archives, Mitchell wrote that he heard piano music at approximately 2:30 a.m. He searched the entire lighthouse and found no source for the sound. He then attempted to radio for assistance but experienced equipment failure. At 3:15 a.m., he reported seeing a female figure standing at the window of the main room. The figure appeared to be looking out at the ocean. When Mitchell called out to her, the figure slowly turned around. The next part of his report is heavily redacted. Whatever Mitchell saw, whatever that thing showed him, the Coast Guard didn't want anyone to know. But there's one sentence that wasn't blacked out. One sentence that tells you everything you need to know. Mitchell wrote, her hands were still playing. He requested immediate transfer the next morning and never returned to Seguin Island. Today, the lighthouse is a museum. Tourists can visit during the summer months. Guided tours take people through the old keeper's quarters, up the spiral staircase, all the way to the top of the tower. And almost every tour group reports the same thing. Some people hear faint music coming from empty rooms. Some people feel sudden cold spots in the middle of warm summer days. Some people see a woman in old-fashioned clothing walking through the halls, only to vanish when they look directly at her. The tour guides have learned to expect it. They warn visitors before the tour begins. They tell them not to be alarmed if they experience something unusual. But they never explain what really happened. They never tell the full story of the keeper and his wife. They say some truths are too horrible for tourists. I spoke to a woman who visited Seguin Island in 2019. Her name was Margaret, and she was 73 years old. She had grown up in Maine and had always wanted to see the famous lighthouse. What she experienced that day changed her life. She told me that halfway through the tour, she felt a hand on her shoulder, a cold hand, ice cold. She spun around, expecting to see another tourist, but no one was there. No one was close enough to have touched her. Then she heard it, piano music, very faint, very far away, but unmistakable. She asked the tour guide if someone was playing music somewhere. The tour guide went pale and said there was no piano on the island. There hadn't been a piano there for over 150 years. Margaret said the music got louder as she walked toward the main room. It was coming from inside. That same melody, simple and sad, repeating over and over. She stepped through the doorway and saw something that she still has nightmares about. A woman was sitting in the corner of the room, wearing an old dress, the kind women wore in the 1800s. Her back was to Margaret. Her hands were raised in front of her, fingers moving rapidly, playing a piano that wasn't there. Margaret couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. She just stood there, frozen, watching this impossible thing. Then the woman slowly turned her head, just her head. Her body stayed facing forward. Her fingers kept moving, and she looked at Margaret with eyes that were completely, utterly black. And she smiled. Margaret fainted. When she woke up, she was outside the lighthouse, surrounded by tour guides and paramedics. They told her she had been screaming so loud they heard her from across the island. She never told anyone exactly what she saw, not until she told me. She said she kept it secret because she didn't want people to think she was crazy. But she knows what she saw, and she will never forget it. The woman at the piano is still there, still playing, still waiting. Maybe she's waiting for her husband to come back. Maybe she's trapped in some kind of loop, reliving the same moments over and over for eternity. Maybe she knows exactly what she's doing and enjoys scaring the visitors who come to her island. Or maybe, just maybe, she's trying to teach someone else her song. If you ever visit Seguin Island, and you hear piano music in the fog, I want you to do something for me. Don't follow it. Don't try to find the source. And whatever you do, don't look into the main room after dark. Because if you see her, if she turns around and looks at you, she might decide that you're going to be her next student. And her lessons last forever. Story 2: The Vanishing of the Flannan Isles Keepers. December 15th, 1900. A ship called the Archtor was sailing past the Flannan Isles, a group of small islands off the west coast of Scotland. The captain looked toward the islands, expecting to see the Flannan Isles lighthouse shining bright, warning ships away from the dangerous rocks. But there was no light. The lighthouse was dark. The captain made a note in his log and reported it when he reached shore. Something was wrong at Flannan Isles. Something had happened to the lighthouse keepers. What they found when they investigated is one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in maritime history. A mystery that has haunted researchers, historians, and ghost hunters for over 100 years. 3 men vanished from that lighthouse without a trace. No bodies, no explanation, no logical answer. And the clues they left behind only make the mystery deeper and more terrifying. Let me take you back to that cold December morning. Let me show you exactly what happened. And let me tell you the theories that have been suggested over the years, including the one that keeps me awake at night. The relief vessel Hesperus arrived at Flannan Isles on December 26, 1900. On board was a lighthouse keeper named Joseph Moore, coming to take his shift at the lighthouse. He had done this dozens of times before. Routine work, nothing unusual. But as the Hesperus approached the island, Moore noticed that something was very wrong. The flag wasn't flying at the lighthouse. The flag was supposed to be raised whenever keepers were on duty. It was a signal that everything was normal, but the flagpole was bare. No one came down to the landing platform to greet the boat. Normally, the keepers would see the relief vessel coming and walk down to help unload supplies. But the landing platform was empty. The lighthouse looked abandoned. Moore felt a cold feeling in his stomach. He had been a keeper for many years. He knew these men: Thomas Marshall, the principal keeper; James Duckett, the first assistant; Donald MacArthur, the second assistant. They were professionals, experienced. They would never abandon their duties. Something had happened to them. Moore climbed the steep path up the cliff to the lighthouse. His heart was pounding. His hands were shaking. The wind was howling around him, and he felt completely alone, even though other sailors were watching from the boat below. He reached the gate to the lighthouse compound. It was closed, but not locked. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The silence was deafening. No sounds of activity, no voices, no footsteps, just the wind and the distant crash of waves. Moore walked to the lighthouse door. It was unlocked. He pushed it open and stepped inside. "Hello?" he called out. "Thomas? James? Donald?" Nothing. His voice echoed off the cold stone walls and faded into silence. Moore searched the ground floor. The kitchen was empty. The fire had been dead for days, the ashes cold and gray. There was a meal on the table, half eaten, as if someone had stood up in the middle of eating and never came back. The clock on the wall had stopped. Moore noted the time. It showed approximately 9:30. He climbed the spiral staircase, his boots echoing in the empty tower. First floor, empty. Second floor, empty. He checked every room, every closet, every corner. The beds were unmade but cold. The personal belongings of the 3 keepers were still there: photographs, books, clothing. Everything looked normal, except there were no keepers. Moore climbed all the way to the lamp room at the top of the lighthouse. The light had been prepared for the evening. The oil reservoir was full. The wicks were trimmed. Everything was ready. But no one was there to light it. 3 men had simply vanished. Moore ran back down the stairs and out of the lighthouse. He waved frantically at the boat below. Something terrible had happened. They needed to search the entire island. For the next several hours, every inch of Flannan Isles was searched. The cliffs, the caves, the rocks, the water around the island. They found nothing. No bodies, no blood, no signs of violence. It was as if Thomas Marshall, James Duckett, and Donald MacArthur had simply stopped existing. But they did find clues. Strange clues. Clues that have puzzled investigators for over a century. First, they found the logbook. Thomas Marshall had been keeping detailed records of everything that happened at the lighthouse. His entries were professional and precise, until the final days. Let me read you those final entries, and pay attention to what he wrote, because this is where the mystery really begins. December 12th, severe winds the like of which I have never seen before in 20 years. William Duckett irritable and quiet. Donald MacArthur crying. Wait, stop, read that again. Donald MacArthur was a seasoned lighthouse keeper, a strong man, a professional. He had weathered countless storms in his career. And he was crying. What could make a grown man, an experienced sailor, break down in tears? December 13th, storm continued through night. William Duckett quiet. Donald MacArthur has been praying. Praying. Now one of them was praying. What were they seeing? What were they experiencing? What was happening on that island? December 14th, noon. Gray daylight. Me, Duckett, and MacArthur prayed. Now all three of them were praying together. Three tough, practical men, praying in the middle of the day. And then the final entry. December 15th, storm ended. Sea calm. God is over all. That was the last entry. After that, nothing. The log was never written in again. But here is the thing that makes this so disturbing. Here is the detail that investigators have never been able to explain. There was no storm. Weather records from the mainland showed no severe storms on December 12th, 13th, or 14th. Ships passing near the Flannan Isles during those days reported calm seas, normal weather, nothing unusual. So what storm was Thomas Marshall writing about? What were those three men so afraid of? What made them pray? The investigation continued. More clues were found, and each one made the mystery deeper. At the West Landing platform, investigators found severe damage. Heavy equipment had been thrown around like toys. Iron railings were bent and twisted. A supply box that weighed over 100 pounds had been ripped from its mountings and hurled against the rocks. Something powerful had hit that landing platform. Something violent. But what? There were no storms recorded, no earthquakes, no tsunamis, no logical explanation for the destruction. And then there were the coats. Inside the lighthouse, investigators found one complete set of oilskin coats and boots. These were the heavy, waterproof clothes that keepers wore when going outside in bad weather. There were supposed to be 3 sets, one for each keeper. But only one set was there. 2 of the keepers had taken their outdoor gear when they left the lighthouse. They had dressed properly for going outside. But the 3rd keeper had left without his coat or boots. Think about that for a moment. It was December. In Scotland, the temperature was near freezing. The wind was brutal. No sane person would go outside without protection. Unless they were in such a hurry that they didn't have time to grab their gear. What could make someone run outside into freezing weather without their coat? What were they running toward? Or what were they running from? Over the years, many theories have been suggested to explain what happened to the 3 keepers of Flannan Isles. Some people believe a giant wave swept the men out to sea while they were trying to secure equipment at the West Landing. A freak wave, appearing out of nowhere, catching them off guard. This theory explains the damage at the landing platform. But it doesn't explain the log entries. It doesn't explain the storm that wasn't there. It doesn't explain why MacArthur was crying and praying. Some people believe one of the keepers went insane from isolation and killed the other 2, then threw himself into the ocean. This would explain why one keeper left without his outdoor gear. He was fleeing from a murderer inside the lighthouse. But there were no signs of violence, no blood, no struggle, no weapon. Some people believe the keepers staged their own disappearance, that they faked their deaths and escaped to start new lives somewhere else. But why? They had families who loved them, jobs they needed. There was no evidence they were unhappy or desperate. And then, there are the other theories, the ones that don't fit into neat, logical boxes, the ones that suggest something supernatural was involved. The Flannan Isles had a dark reputation long before the lighthouse was built. Local fishermen called them the Isles of the Seven Hunters, and they believed the islands were cursed. They said ancient spirits lived there, spirits that didn't like visitors. When the lighthouse was being constructed in 1899, workers reported strange experiences. Tools would go missing and then reappear in impossible locations. Men heard voices at night, speaking in a language no one could understand. Several workers quit, saying they felt like they were being watched by something hostile. One worker claimed to have seen figures on the cliffs at night, dark figures, standing motionless, watching the construction. He said they didn't look quite human. The locals warned the Lighthouse Commission not to build on those islands. They said it was dangerous. They said the spirits wouldn't tolerate a permanent human presence. They were ignored. And now 3 men were gone. Some researchers believe that the keepers saw something on December 12th. Something in the water. Something that rose up from the depths during a storm that only existed in that one spot, on that one island, unseen by anyone else. They believe the keepers witnessed something so terrifying that it broke their minds, made them cry, made them pray, made them desperate. And on December 15th, when Thomas Marshall wrote "God is over all," he wasn't expressing relief that a storm had ended. He was saying goodbye. Because whatever they had seen was coming back, and they knew they couldn't escape. This theory suggests that the keepers didn't run away from the lighthouse. They were taken, pulled into the sea by something that had been watching them for days. Something that had finally decided to claim them. After the incident, new keepers were assigned to Flannan Isles Lighthouse, and almost immediately, they started reporting strange experiences. Footsteps in empty rooms, voices whispering in the wind. The feeling of being watched constantly, never having a moment of privacy. One keeper, stationed there in 1901, wrote in his personal diary about seeing 3 figures standing on the cliffs at night. They were looking out at the ocean, their backs to the lighthouse. He called out to them, thinking they were visitors who had somehow reached the island. They didn't respond. He walked toward them, getting closer and closer. When he was about 50 feet away, all 3 figures slowly turned to look at him. He couldn't see their faces. It was too dark, but he could feel their eyes on him, cold, empty, waiting. And then, one by one, they walked toward the edge of the cliff, and stepped off. The keeper ran to the edge, expecting to see bodies on the rocks below, but there was nothing, just the black water and the white foam of breaking waves. He requested immediate transfer the next morning. Throughout the 20th century, similar reports continued. Keepers saw the 3 figures again and again, always at night, always standing on the cliffs, always walking into the sea. Some keepers claimed to hear knocking on the lighthouse door in the middle of the night. When they opened it, no one was there, but they found wet footprints leading from the door, footprints that came from the direction of the ocean. One keeper, in the 1970s, claimed to have a conversation with Thomas Marshall. He said he woke up in the middle of the night to find a man standing in his room. The man was wearing old-fashioned clothing, soaking wet, as if he had just climbed out of the ocean. Water was dripping from his beard and pooling on the floor. The keeper asked who he was and how he had gotten into the lighthouse. The man said his name was Thomas. He said he was the keeper of this lighthouse. He said he had come back to warn him. Warn him about what? The keeper asked. Thomas looked toward the window, toward the dark ocean outside, and said, "They're still out there, waiting. Don't let them see you watching. Don't let them know you can see them, or they'll come for you too." Then Thomas walked toward the door, opened it, and walked outside into the freezing night. The keeper ran after him, but there was no one on the path, no footprints in the frost, no sign that anyone had been there at all. The Flannan Isles lighthouse was automated in 1971. No human keepers live there anymore. But visitors to the island still report seeing them. 3 figures, standing on the cliffs, looking out at the sea, waiting. What happened to Thomas Marshall, James Duckett, and Donald MacArthur? Where did they go? What did they see in those final days? The official investigation was closed without a conclusion. The mystery remains unsolved. It will probably remain unsolved forever. But I believe something did happen on that island. Something that science can't explain. Something that broke those 3 men. Something that took them. And whatever it was, it's still there. So if you ever find yourself near the Flannan Isles on a dark, foggy night, and you see 3 figures standing on the cliffs, don't wave to them, don't call out to them, don't let them know you can see them. Because Thomas Marshall gave us a warning, and I think we should listen. They're still out there, waiting. Story 3, The Smalls Lighthouse Horror. There is a rock in the middle of the Irish Sea, a tiny, jagged rock barely big enough to stand on, 20 miles from the nearest land, surrounded by some of the most dangerous waters in the world. On this rock, in 1776, they built a lighthouse. They built it on wooden stilts, like a house standing on legs, because the rock was too small for a traditional foundation. The waves would crash through the stilts, but the lighthouse above would stay dry. At least, that was the theory. In reality, the Smalls Lighthouse was a death trap, a nightmare, the most terrifying place a lighthouse keeper could ever be assigned. And in the winter of 1801, it became the setting for one of the most disturbing horror stories in maritime history. A story so horrible that it changed lighthouse keeping forever. A story about 2 men trapped together with death itself. This is the story of Thomas Howell and Thomas Griffith, and I promise you, this one will haunt you. Thomas Howell and Thomas Griffith were both lighthouse keepers. They were both professionals. They were both experienced. And they absolutely hated each other. The 2 men were famous throughout the local villages for their constant arguments. They disagreed about everything: politics, religion, the proper way to maintain a lighthouse, the proper way to cook dinner. They couldn't be in the same room for 5 minutes without starting a fight. Nobody knows exactly why they despised each other so much. Maybe it was a personality clash. Maybe there was history between them that has been lost to time. Maybe some people are just destined to be enemies. Whatever the reason, Thomas Howell and Thomas Griffith were the worst possible pair to be trapped together in a tiny lighthouse 20 miles from shore. But in 1801, that's exactly what happened. Both men were assigned to the Smalls Lighthouse for the winter season. The lighthouse authority knew about their rivalry, but they didn't have enough keepers to give them different assignments, so they sent both Thomases out to that lonely rock and hoped for the best. It was a disaster from day one. The Smalls Lighthouse was incredibly small. The living quarters were barely 10 feet across. 2 men living in a space smaller than a prison cell, eating together, sleeping together, working together. with no escape for months. Howell and Griffith argued constantly, screaming matches that echoed across the water. Sometimes they would go days without speaking, the silence even more oppressive than the fighting. Sometimes they would get into physical altercations, shoving and punching until one of them backed down. Other lighthouse keepers on the mainland could see the Smalls through their telescopes. They joked about the fighting Thomases. They made bets on which one would snap first. Nobody was laughing by spring. In late January 1801, Thomas Griffith became ill. At first, it seemed like a simple cold, coughing, sneezing, a mild fever. Griffith complained about feeling tired and stayed in bed for a day or two. But he didn't get better. He got worse. Much worse. The fever climbed higher and higher. Griffith started having trouble breathing. He couldn't keep food down. He would drift in and out of consciousness, mumbling incoherently. Thomas Howell, despite hating the man, tried to take care of him. He brought him water. He kept him warm. He tried to make soup from their limited supplies. He did everything he could think of. But there was no medicine on the Smalls, no doctor, no way to get help. The winter storms made it impossible for supply boats to reach them. They were completely, utterly cut off. Howell watched Griffith die slowly over the course of 2 weeks. 2 weeks of listening to the man cough and wheeze and moan. 2 weeks of watching him waste away. 2 weeks of knowing that help was out there somewhere, but it wasn't coming. 2 weeks of being completely alone with death. And then, on a cold February morning, Thomas Griffith took his last breath. Thomas Howell was now truly alone, more alone than he had ever been in his entire life. But his nightmare was just beginning. Because now Howell had a problem, a terrible, horrible problem. What was he supposed to do with the body? You might think the answer is obvious. Bury him at sea. Give him a proper sailor's farewell. Let the ocean take him. But Howell couldn't do that, because everyone knew that he and Griffith hated each other. Everyone had seen them fighting. Everyone had heard the stories about their violent arguments. If Howell threw the body into the sea, people would assume he had murdered Griffith. He would be arrested when he returned to shore. He would be put on trial. He could be hanged. In 1801, murder was punishable by death. And who would believe that Griffith had died of natural causes? Who would take the word of a man known for fighting with the victim? Howell had no way to prove his innocence. No witnesses. No doctor's report. Nothing. So he made a decision. The only decision he thought he could make. He would keep the body until help arrived. He would preserve it as best he could, so that when the supply boat finally came, he could show them that Griffith had died of illness. He could prove that he hadn't killed him. He could clear his name. It seemed like a reasonable plan at the time. It turned into a living nightmare. First, Howell tried to keep the body inside the lighthouse, but within days, the decomposition made that impossible. The smell was unbearable. It filled every corner of the tiny living space. Howell couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't breathe without gagging. So he moved the body outside. He built a makeshift coffin out of spare wood and old crates. He placed Griffith's body inside, and then he tied the coffin to the railing outside the lighthouse, exposed to the elements, but at least away from the living quarters. The supply boat would come soon, he told himself. Any day now. He just had to wait. But the supply boat didn't come. The storms continued, week after week. The seas were too rough. No boat could reach the Smalls. Howell was trapped on that rock with the corpse of his enemy. 1 week passed, 2 weeks, a month, 6 weeks. The body began to break down. Even in the cold sea air, the coffin, made from cheap wood, started to warp and crack. The nails began to rust and pop loose. And then the storms got worse. One particularly brutal night, the wind howled so loud that Howell couldn't hear himself think. The waves crashed through the lighthouse stilts with tremendous force. The whole structure shook like it might collapse at any moment. Howell huddled inside, praying for morning, praying for the storm to end. And then he heard something even louder than the wind and waves. A creaking sound, coming from outside, from the coffin. The storm had damaged the coffin, the wood had split open, and Thomas Griffith's body was exposed. Howell tried not to look. He tried to stay inside and ignore it, but the lighthouse was small, and the windows faced the railing where the coffin was tied. He couldn't avoid seeing it. The body was falling apart. Decomposition had taken its toll. Flesh was sloughing off bone. The face was no longer recognizable as human. And then the wind did something that would haunt Howell for the rest of his life. The wind found its way into the broken coffin. It pushed against the body. It moved things that shouldn't move. Griffith's arm, loosened by decay, broke free from the coffin. It fell over the railing, dangling in the open air. And every time the wind blew, the arm moved. It swung back and forth. It raised and lowered. The hand opened and closed. From inside the lighthouse, looking through the window, it looked exactly like a man beckoning, waving, calling to Howell. Come here, come outside, come join me. Day and night, every time the wind blew. For 4 months. Thomas Howell couldn't escape it. He couldn't look away. No matter where he went in the lighthouse, he could see that arm through some window, that hand, those fingers, moving, always moving. He tried covering the windows, but the lighthouse needed light to function. He couldn't block them all. He tried not looking, but the movement in his peripheral vision was constant, impossible to ignore. The arm followed him, watched him, beckoned him. Howell started talking to it, to Griffith, apologizing for all their arguments, begging for forgiveness, screaming at the dead man to leave him alone. Griffith never responded, but the arm kept moving. Howell stopped sleeping. The moment he closed his eyes, he saw that arm reaching for him, grabbing him, pulling him outside into the storm and sea. He stopped eating. Food made him sick. Everything tasted like death. He started having conversations with people who weren't there. His mother, dead for 10 years. His childhood friends, people he had known and lost. They would appear in the lighthouse, talk to him for hours, and then vanish. And sometimes, Griffith would appear too. Not the corpse on the railing, the real Griffith, alive, healthy, standing in the kitchen, cooking dinner like nothing had happened, sitting in the chair, reading a book. They would have conversations, normal conversations, as if Griffith had never died at all. And then Howell would blink, and Griffith would be gone, and he would look out the window and see the arm, still moving, still beckoning. Howell was losing his mind. He knew it. He could feel his sanity slipping away day by day, but there was nothing he could do about it. He couldn't escape the lighthouse. He couldn't escape the body. He couldn't escape the arm. He was trapped in hell. On the mainland, people noticed that the Smalls lighthouse was still operating. They could see the light burning at night. They could see movement in the windows through their telescopes. They even saw a figure on the railing, a figure that seemed to be waving at them. They assumed everything was fine. They assumed the keepers were just signaling hello. They had no idea that the figure waving was a dead man. The supply boat finally reached the Smalls in May, 4 months after Griffith's death, 4 months of unimaginable horror for Thomas Howell. When the crew climbed up to the lighthouse, they found a scene from a nightmare. The coffin on the railing had been destroyed by months of storms. Griffith's remains were barely recognizable as human. The smell was overwhelming. And Thomas Howell. He was alive. Technically, his heart was beating, his lungs were breathing, but the man they had known was gone. His hair had turned completely white, all of it, in just 4 months. His eyes were vacant, empty, like windows into a dark, abandoned house. He couldn't speak. When they asked him questions, he just stared at them, through them, like he was looking at something only he could see. He couldn't walk without help. His legs seemed to have forgotten how to function. He didn't recognize anyone, not his friends, not his family, not even his own reflection. Thomas Howell had been driven completely, irreversibly insane. The lighthouse authorities launched an investigation. They interviewed the doctors who examined Howell. They inspected the lighthouse and the remains of Griffith's body. They tried to piece together what had happened during those 4 terrible months. Their conclusion was simple and devastating. Thomas Howell had been destroyed by prolonged exposure to death and isolation. His mind had broken under the strain. There was no hope of recovery. Howell spent the rest of his life in an institution. He never spoke again. He never recognized anyone again. He would sometimes stand at windows and wave, mimicking the motion he had watched for 4 months. And sometimes, late at night, he would scream. Just one word, over and over again. Thomas, Thomas, Thomas. He was calling for Griffith, even in madness. He was still trapped with the man he had hated, still trapped with that beckoning arm. Thomas Howell died in 1812, 11 years after his rescue from the Smalls. He never recovered. He never returned to the sea. He spent his final years in a small room, waving at shadows and screaming at ghosts. But the story doesn't end there. Because of what happened to Thomas Howell, the lighthouse authorities made a new rule, a rule that would be followed at lighthouses around the world for the next 2 centuries. From that point forward, every lighthouse would have at least 3 keepers, never 2, always 3. This became known as the Smalls Lighthouse Rule. The idea was simple: if one keeper died, the remaining 2 could support each other. No one would ever have to face death alone again. It was a small change, just one extra person, but it was made because of the horror that Thomas Howell experienced. And what about the Smalls Lighthouse itself? It was rebuilt multiple times over the years. The wooden structure was replaced with stone. The old lighthouse was torn down and a new one was built. Everything changed. But some things stayed the same. Keepers who worked at the Smalls in later years reported strange experiences. They heard scratching sounds on the windows at night, like fingernails dragging across glass. They felt cold spots that moved through rooms, as if something invisible was walking past. And sometimes, on stormy nights, they would look out the window and see something on the rocks below. A figure, standing motionless, looking up at the lighthouse. An arm raised, a hand beckoning. Come here, come outside, come join me. Some keepers said it was just their imagination, tricks of light and shadow, the power of suggestion from knowing the lighthouse's history. Others weren't so sure. The Smalls Lighthouse was finally automated in 1987. No human keepers live there anymore. The light turns on and off by computer. The machinery is maintained by occasional helicopter visits. But if you ever take a boat past the Smalls on a stormy night, and you see the light flashing in the darkness, remember what happened there. Remember Thomas Howell. Remember Thomas Griffith. Remember 4 months of hell. And if you see something on the rocks below the lighthouse, something that seems to be waving at you, don't wave back. Because some invitations should never be accepted. Story 4, The Creature of Point Sur. On the central coast of California, there is a massive rock called Point Sur. It rises 361 feet straight up from the Pacific Ocean, like a giant standing guard over the coastline. At the top of this rock sits one of the most isolated lighthouses in America. To get to Point Sur Lighthouse, you have to climb a narrow path up the steep cliff. There are no roads leading there, no easy access, just a thin trail carved into the rock face, with a deadly drop on one side and jagged stone on the other. The lighthouse was built in 1889 to warn ships away from the treacherous rocks. For over a century, lighthouse keepers lived and worked at the top of that cliff, completely cut off from the rest of the world. Most of them reported nothing unusual, just the normal loneliness and hard work that came with the job. But some of them saw something else. Something that came out of the water. Something that shouldn't exist. This is the story of the Point Sur creature, and unlike our other stories, this one has multiple witnesses, multiple sightings, decades of reports. Something lives in the waters near Point Sur, and it has been watching us. The first documented sighting happened in 1912. A keeper named Walter Phillips was performing his nightly check of the lighthouse equipment. It was around 2 a.m., foggy, cold, the kind of night where you can barely see 10 feet in front of you. Phillips was walking along the cliff edge, checking the path for storm damage, when he heard a sound. A wet, slapping noise, like something large pulling itself across stone. He stopped, listened. The sound continued. It was coming from below, from the rocks at the base of the cliff. Phillips grabbed his lantern and walked to the edge. He held the light out over the darkness and looked down. At first, he saw nothing but fog and shadow, just the white spray of waves hitting rocks. And then the fog shifted. Something was down there, something big, much bigger than any sea lion or seal. It was pale, grayish-white, glistening in the lantern light. And it was moving, not swimming, not floating, moving across the rocks on limbs. Phillips couldn't see clearly through the fog, but he could tell that whatever was down there didn't move like any animal he knew. It crawled, pulled itself forward with movements that were wrong somehow, joints bending in directions they shouldn't bend. He stood frozen, watching this thing make its way across the rocks, heading toward the cliff, heading toward the path, heading toward him. And then it stopped. Phillips would later describe what happened next as the most terrifying moment of his life. The creature raised what might have been a head. It turned toward the cliff, toward the light, toward Phillips. He couldn't see details. The fog was too thick, but he felt its attention on him, felt it looking at him, studying him. And then it opened its mouth. Phillips didn't hear a sound, but he felt one, a vibration that went through his whole body, through his bones, through his brain, like something was trying to communicate directly with his nervous system. The lantern fell from his numb fingers and crashed on the rocks below. The light went out. Darkness swallowed everything. Phillips ran. He ran faster than he had ever run in his life. Up the path, through the door, into the lighthouse. He locked every lock, closed every window, and he didn't leave until morning. When the sun came up, Phillips went back to the cliff edge. He found his lantern, shattered on the rocks below. and he found marks. Drag marks, gouges in the stone, leading from the water's edge to the base of the cliff, as if something had crawled out of the ocean and tried to climb up. But there was nothing there now. Whatever it was, it had gone back to the sea. Phillips wrote a report about what he saw. His supervisors dismissed it as imagination, a trick of the fog, maybe a diseased sea lion with unusual movements, nothing to worry about. But Phillips knew what he saw, and he wasn't alone. Over the next several decades, other keepers at Point Sur reported similar experiences. In 1924, a keeper named James Worth claimed to hear something scratching at the lighthouse door in the middle of the night. The scratching continued for over an hour. When he finally got the courage to open the door in the morning, he found deep gouges in the wood, gouges that were nearly 7 feet off the ground. What kind of animal could reach that high? What kind of animal would scratch at a door for an hour? In 1938, 2 keepers reported seeing something swimming in the water directly below the lighthouse. They described it as impossibly large and wrong-shaped. One of them grabbed a pair of binoculars and tried to get a better look. What he saw made him drop the binoculars. He never told anyone exactly what he saw through those lenses. He just said it was not meant for human eyes. He requested a transfer the next day and never worked at a lighthouse again. In 1957, the incident I mentioned earlier happened. Robert Harding, a keeper doing routine maintenance, saw the creature on the rocks, pale, crawling, with eyes that were intelligent, hungry. He said it looked at him, really looked at him, like it was reading his mind, like it was deciding whether he was worth eating. Harding also reported the vibration, the feeling of something speaking directly to his body. He said it felt like the creature was trying to tell him something, trying to communicate. But he couldn't understand the message. It was in a language that humans weren't meant to know. The Coast Guard took over Point Sur Lighthouse in the 1960s. Military personnel replaced civilian keepers. These were trained, disciplined, practical men. They didn't believe in sea monsters or supernatural creatures. Their beliefs changed quickly. In 1971, a Coast Guard officer named Michael Torres was on night watch at Point Sur. He was checking the lighthouse beam, making sure it was rotating properly, when he heard something outside. Voices. Not the wind, not waves, voices, speaking words he couldn't understand. Torres went to the window and looked out. The fog was thick that night, rolling across the rock like a living thing. He couldn't see the ground below, but he could hear the voices clearly now, multiple voices, coming from somewhere on the rock, somewhere close. Torres grabbed his flashlight and his radio. He reported the voices to the base station. They told him to investigate but stay cautious. He opened the lighthouse door and stepped outside. The voices stopped immediately. Torres walked carefully along the path, sweeping his flashlight across the rocks. The fog made everything look strange. Shapes seemed to move in his peripheral vision. Shadows stretched and shifted. He reached the edge of the cliff and looked down toward the water. What he saw made him fall backward onto the ground. There were shapes in the water, multiple shapes, pale and grayish, clustered together at the base of the cliff. They weren't swimming, they were floating, stationary, facing upward, facing him. And they were speaking. Torres could hear them clearly now, a gurgling, burbling sound that somehow formed words. Words that weren't English, weren't any language he had ever heard, but words nonetheless. They were talking to each other, about him. Torres scrambled to his feet and ran back to the lighthouse. He radioed the base station and reported what he had seen. He was ordered to stay inside and lock all doors. In the morning, a team was sent to investigate. They found nothing in the water. No creatures, no bodies, no evidence that anything unusual had been there. But they did find something on the rocks near the cliff base. Footprints. Not human footprints. Something else. Something with too many toes. Something that left deep impressions in solid stone. The footprints led from the water's edge to the base of the cliff, and then up the cliff face. Whatever had made those prints had climbed a 300-foot vertical rock wall. And there were more footprints at the top, near the lighthouse door. Torres was transferred to a different assignment. He never spoke publicly about what he experienced, but years later, his family found his personal journals after he passed away. In those journals, Torres wrote about the incident in detail. He described the creatures in the water. He described their voices. He described the feeling of being watched, being assessed, being measured. And he wrote about a dream he had been having ever since that night. The same dream, over and over, for the rest of his life. In the dream, he was standing at the edge of the cliff, looking down at the water, and the creatures were looking back up at him. One of them was climbing the cliff, getting closer, always getting closer. And in the dream, it finally reached him. It opened its mouth, and he heard its voice clearly for the first time. Not the gurgling sound, real words, in perfect English. It said, "We've been waiting for you. We've been waiting so long. Now you can come home." Torres always woke up before the creature touched him, but every time he had the dream, it got a little closer. He died in 2003. His family said he seemed at peace in his final moments, but there was something strange about his passing. Just before he died, he spoke his last words. He said, "They're here." The most disturbing incident at Point Sur happened in 1985. 3 Coast Guard officers were stationed at the lighthouse for routine maintenance. Their names were Richard Gomez, Thomas Williams, and Patricia Chin. They arrived in the afternoon and planned to stay for 3 days. Simple work. Check the equipment, make repairs, document everything. The first day was uneventful. The weather was clear. The work went smoothly. They ate dinner together in the lighthouse kitchen and went to bed early. That night, everything changed. At approximately 2 a.m., all 3 officers were awakened by a sound, a loud, heavy impact, like something had hit the lighthouse door. Gomez was the first to reach the main room. He grabbed his flashlight and approached the door. Another impact. The whole door shook on its hinges. "Who's there?" Gomez called out. Silence. Williams and Chin joined him. All 3 stood in the main room, staring at the door, waiting. Then they heard something else, a sound that made all 3 of them take a step backward. A voice, coming from outside, speaking words they couldn't understand. Not yelling, not whispering, a normal conversational tone, as if someone was standing on the other side of the door, talking casually. But the words were wrong. The sounds were wrong. It wasn't English. It wasn't Spanish. It wasn't any language any of them had ever heard. And yet, there was something almost familiar about it, like hearing a song you know played in a different key, like reading a word written in a mirror. The voice went on for several minutes, then it stopped. Another impact on the door, harder this time. The wood cracked. "We need to barricade this," Williams said. They pushed furniture against the door, a heavy table, chairs, everything they could move. Then they retreated to the center of the room and waited. For the next 6 hours, Something tried to get into the lighthouse. It hit the door. It scratched at the windows. It circled the building, banging on walls, looking for a weak point. And it kept talking, that horrible, almost familiar voice, sometimes quiet, sometimes screaming, always in that unknown language. Around 4 a.m., Chen said something that neither of the other officers would ever forget. She said, "I think I understand it." Gomez and Williams looked at her. "What do you mean?" Gomez asked. Chen's eyes were unfocused, distant. "It's telling us something. About the water. About what lives down there. About how old they are. How long they've been waiting." "Waiting for what?" Chen blinked. The distant look faded. "I don't know. I can't hear it anymore." The banging stopped at dawn. The voice stopped. Whatever had been outside retreated with the darkness. The 3 officers opened the door carefully, weapons ready, expecting to find something. The rock in front of the lighthouse was covered in a thick, grayish slime. It smelled like rotting fish and something else. Something chemical. Something wrong. And there were marks on the door. Deep scratches. Hundreds of them, covering every inch of wood. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the footprints. They covered the ground all around the lighthouse. Dozens of footprints, overlapping, going in circles, as if multiple creatures had been walking around the building all night. And the footprints weren't all the same size. Some were smaller than a human hand. Some were larger than a dinner plate. Different sizes, different shapes, as if different types of creatures had been there. Following the footprints led down the cliff path, to the water's edge, and into the ocean. Whatever had come, had brought friends. The 3 officers reported everything to their superiors. They documented the slime, the scratches, the footprints. They took photographs. Most of those photographs were classified. They have never been released to the public. But one photo leaked in 2007. It showed the lighthouse door, covered in scratches, and in the upper right corner of the door, barely visible in the morning light, was something else. A handprint. It had too many fingers. After the 1985 incident, the Coast Guard began limiting time spent at Point Sur Lighthouse. Officers were not allowed to stay overnight unless absolutely necessary. Maintenance was scheduled during daylight hours only. The lighthouse was fully automated in 1987. No humans live there anymore. But visitors to Point Sur today still report strange things. Tour groups sometimes hear sounds from the rocks below. Wet, slapping sounds, like something moving. Hikers on nearby trails have reported seeing pale shapes in the water near the lighthouse rock. Shapes that don't move like normal sea animals. And photographers who try to take pictures at night sometimes capture something unexpected in their images. Shapes in the fog, faces in the water, eyes reflecting the camera flash from places where nothing should be. What lives in the waters around Point Sur? What has been watching that lighthouse for over a century? What tried to break down the door in 1985? Nobody knows for certain. But whatever it is, it's still there. And it's still waiting. If you ever visit Point Sur Lighthouse, I want you to be careful. Stay with the tour group. Don't wander off alone. And whatever you do, don't go there at night. Because something lives in those waters. Something ancient. Something patient. Something that has been waiting a very long time for the right person to answer its call. Don't be that person. And if you hear a voice speaking words you almost understand, if you feel something calling to you from the depths, walk away. Run if you have to. Some questions are better left unanswered. Some places are better left unexplored, and some creatures are better left unfound. Story 5: The Lighthouse Keeper Who Went Crazy. Now we come to our final story, and I saved this one for last because it is the most disturbing of all 5 stories. This is not about ghosts. This is not about monsters. This is about what happens when a human mind breaks completely, when loneliness eats a person from the inside out, when the darkness wins. This story comes from the St. Augustine Lighthouse in Florida, and what happened there in 1859 still haunts that place to this very day. Let me tell you about a man named Joseph Andrew. He was the head lighthouse keeper at St. Augustine. He had worked there for many years. He was a good man, a family man. He had a wife and children who lived in a small house near the lighthouse. But Joseph had a problem that would destroy him. He was afraid of heights. Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, how can a lighthouse keeper be afraid of heights? Lighthouses are tall. That is the whole point. And you would be right to ask that question. Joseph took the job because he needed money. His family was poor. There were not many jobs available. The lighthouse keeper position paid well, so Joseph pushed down his fear. He told himself he could handle it. He told himself the fear would go away. But fears like that do not go away. They grow. They get stronger. They wait for the perfect moment to strike. Every single day Joseph had to climb to the top of the lighthouse. Every single day he had to look down at the ground far below. Every single day his heart would race and his hands would shake and his mind would scream at him to run. But he did not run. He climbed those stairs. He did his job. He kept the light burning. For years this went on. Joseph fighting his fear every single day, never telling anyone how much he suffered, never admitting how close he was to breaking. His wife noticed changes in him. He started having nightmares. He would wake up screaming about falling, about the ground rushing up to meet him, about darkness swallowing him whole. He started talking to himself, mumbling under his breath as he climbed the lighthouse stairs, saying things that did not make sense, prayers mixed with curses, pleas mixed with threats. But still he climbed, still he worked, still he kept his secret. Then came the day that changed everything. In 1859 the lighthouse needed repairs. The outside of the tower had to be painted, and Joseph was told he had to do it. He had to hang on the outside of the lighthouse, suspended by ropes, hundreds of feet in the air, nothing below him but hard ground. Joseph begged to be excused from this duty. He made up excuses. He said he was sick. He said his back hurt. He said anything he could think of. But his bosses did not care. The job needed to be done. Joseph was the head keeper. It was his responsibility. So on a bright sunny morning Joseph Andrew tied a rope around his waist. He attached it to the top of the lighthouse, and he began to lower himself down the outside of the tower. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold on. His legs felt like water. His heart was beating so fast he thought it might explode out of his chest. But he started painting, slowly, carefully, trying not to look down, trying not to think about the empty air below him, trying not to imagine what would happen if the rope broke. For an hour he worked, then 2 hours. His arms ached, his shoulders burned, but he kept going. He was almost done. Just a little more and he could climb back inside, back to safety. And then he made a mistake, a small mistake, a fatal mistake. He looked down. Something made him do it. Maybe curiosity, maybe his fear forcing him to face itself, maybe something else entirely. But Joseph Andrew looked down at the ground below, and his mind snapped. Everything he had been holding inside for years came flooding out. All the fear, all the terror, all the nightmares. It all hit him at once like a tidal wave. Joseph screamed, a scream so loud that people heard it a mile away, a scream that did not sound human at all. And then he let go of the rope. Some people say he let go on purpose, that his mind could not take it anymore and he chose to end his suffering. Other people say his hands simply stopped working, that his fear paralyzed him so completely that his fingers just opened. Either way, the result was the same. Joseph Andrew fell. He fell screaming all the way down. He hit the ground at the base of the lighthouse, right in front of his own home, right where his children could see. He died instantly. But here's where this story becomes truly terrifying, because Joseph Andrew did not leave that lighthouse. Not really. Not completely. Within days of his death, strange things started happening. The new lighthouse keeper heard footsteps on the stairs when no one was there. He heard someone crying in the tower. He heard a voice mumbling the same words Joseph used to mumble as he climbed. At first people thought it was just the wind, just the building settling, just imagination. But then people started seeing things. A figure on the lighthouse stairs, walking up, always walking up, never reaching the top, just climbing and climbing and climbing forever. A shadow at the windows, looking down, always looking down, like someone afraid of the height but unable to look away. And sometimes late at night people would hear a scream, the same scream Joseph made when he fell, coming from the top of the lighthouse, coming from empty air. Joseph's wife refused to leave the area. She stayed in her house near the lighthouse. She said she could feel her husband there. She said she talked to him every night. She said he answered. Her children grew up in that house. They all reported the same thing. They all felt their father watching them. They all heard him walking in the lighthouse at night. They all knew he never really left. Over the years, the hauntings at St. Augustine Lighthouse became famous. Hundreds of people have reported seeing Joseph's ghost. Hundreds more have heard his footsteps or his crying or his final scream. Paranormal investigators have visited the lighthouse many times. They have recorded voices. They have captured photographs of shadows that should not be there. They have measured sudden temperature drops and electromagnetic spikes. One investigator said something that stuck with me. He said that most ghosts seem confused, lost, like they do not know they are dead. But Joseph is different. Joseph knows exactly where he is. He is just too afraid to leave. Think about that for a moment. A man so terrified of heights that even death could not free him. A soul trapped forever in the place he feared most. Climbing those stairs for eternity. Looking down at the ground that killed him. Reliving his worst moment over and over and over. That is not a ghost story. That is a tragedy. A never-ending nightmare that has been going on for over 160 years. The St. Augustine Lighthouse still operates today. You can visit it. You can climb those same stairs that Joseph climbed. You can look out from the same windows that terrified him so much. But if you do, let me give you some advice. If you feel someone behind you on those stairs, do not turn around. If you hear crying from somewhere above, do not investigate. If you see a shadow pass by the window, do not look too closely. Because Joseph is still there, still climbing, still afraid, still falling. And some say that if you meet his eyes, if you really see him, you will feel what he felt. That absolute terror, that complete breakdown of the mind, that moment when fear wins and everything else loses. Some visitors to the lighthouse have had panic attacks on those stairs. Some have frozen completely, unable to move up or down. Some have run screaming from the building and refused to ever come back. They all say the same thing. They felt him. They felt Joseph. They felt his fear become their fear. Even in death, he is not alone in his suffering. He makes sure of that. And there you have it. 5 true lighthouse horror stories. 5 tales of terror from the loneliest places on earth. 5 reasons to be afraid of the dark and the sea and the things that wait in both. We started with the ghost of a woman playing piano music that has echoed through a lighthouse for over 150 years. We traveled to Scotland where 3 men vanished without a trace, leaving behind nothing but mysteries and unanswered questions. We felt the madness of a man trapped for months with a corpse that seemed to wave at him day and night. We heard about creatures from the deep that came onto land and tried to speak to the humans in their towers. And we ended with a man whose fear was so powerful that not even death could release him from it. These stories are all true. These things really happened. These places really exist. And whatever haunts them is still there right now as you listen to these words. Lighthouses were built to be places of safety, beacons of hope in the darkness, guides for lost souls trying to find their way home. But something went wrong. Somewhere along the way, these places of light became places of darkness. The isolation broke people. The loneliness drove them mad. The sea sent things that should have stayed hidden in the depths. And now those lighthouses hold more than just lights. They hold memories. They hold pain. They hold the souls of everyone who ever suffered within their walls. If you ever visit a lighthouse, remember what you learned tonight. Remember that the walls have witnessed things you cannot imagine. Remember that the stairs have felt footsteps that left no body behind. Remember that the windows have shown horrors that no human was meant to see. And when you stand at the top looking out at the endless sea, ask yourself a question. Are you really alone up there? Or is something standing right behind you, watching, waiting, remembering? The lighthouse keepers knew the truth. They lived with it every day. They watched their friends disappear. They heard their families cry from beyond the grave. They saw things in the water that science says cannot exist. Most of them are gone now. Automation has replaced human keepers almost everywhere. The lights still burn, but no living person tends them anymore. But that does not mean the lighthouses are empty. Oh no. They have never been empty, and they never will be. Something lives in those towers, something that was always there, something that watched the first keepers arrive and will watch the last visitors leave, something patient, something old, something hungry for company in the endless dark. So the next time you see a lighthouse in the distance, that beam of light cutting through the night, remember these stories. Remember the piano that never stops playing. Remember the 3 men who walked into the sea. Remember the corpse that waved for 4 months. Remember the creatures that learned to speak. Remember the man who falls forever. And ask yourself, would you spend one night in a lighthouse alone? Could you handle the silence, the isolation, the feeling of being watched by something you cannot see? Could you keep your sanity when the walls start whispering? When the stairs creak with invisible footsteps? When something knocks on the door at midnight and you know there is no one alive on that island but you? The lighthouse keepers thought they could handle it. They were wrong. What makes you think you would be any different? Sleep well tonight. Keep your lights on if you need to. And if you hear piano music in the distance, or see a figure standing by the water, or feel a cold hand touch your shoulder in the dark, well then maybe these stories found you for a reason. Maybe the lighthouses are calling. Maybe it is your turn to keep the light burning. Forever. And ever. And ever. If you made it to the end of this video, you are braver than most people. You sat through an hour of true horror without looking away. That takes courage. Or maybe curiosity. Or maybe something else drew you here tonight. Either way, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Thank you for believing, even just for a moment, that there are things in this world we cannot explain. Like and subscribe if you want more stories like these. Comment below if you have ever visited a haunted lighthouse or experienced something you cannot explain. Share this video with someone who thinks they are brave enough to watch it alone in the dark. And remember, no matter where you are right now, no matter how safe you feel, someone somewhere is standing in a lighthouse looking out at the Black Sea, wondering what is looking back at them. Tonight, that person might be you. Good night, everyone. Stay safe. And whatever you do, do not answer if the sea calls your name.